Welcome back, my friends. Once again, we're here with Pastor Bruce Dowell. And with everything going on in the country right now, there's an issue that's kind of confusing people. And we see people that are on both sides of it. So what is this issue? Well, in Romans 13, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Everyone is to obey the governing authorities, for there is no authority that is not from God, and the existing authorities have been placed where they are by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities is resisting what God has instituted, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." Now, we can see this, and a lot of things going on in our nation, especially, don't seem to be of God. But what this says, God is trying us. The conflict arises when we look at Acts chapter 5, verses 26 to 29. And this is about the arrest of Peter. "The captain and his officers went and brought them, but not with force, because they were afraid of being stoned by the people. They conducted them to the Sanhedrin, where the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, demanded of them, 'We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name. But look here, you have filled Jerusalem with your teachings. Moreover, you are determined to make us responsible for this man's death.' But Kepha and the other emissaries answered, 'We must obey God and not man.'" Well, there's a big conflict here. Who are we to obey? We need to really take a closer look at it. Mm-hmm. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 to 25, it says, "Let us continue holding fast to the hope we acknowledge without wavering, for the one who makes the promise is trustworthy. And let us keep paying attention to one another in order to spur each other on to love and good deeds, not neglecting our own congregational meetings, as some have made a practice doing, but rather encouraging each other. And let us do this all the more as you see the day approaching." Now, we know the government has mandated that a lot of the churches be shut down, and a lot of the churches are not doing that. So why are some doing it and why are some not? Well, that's the conflict we see in the verses above. One thing we need to understand, though, we need to be aware of the laws and what they are. Mm-hmm. Now, we live in a free nation, and part of that is the First Amendment of the Constitution, which says the government shall not make any rules prohibiting the meeting of churches. Right. So, on April 11th, 2021, CBS News reported California cannot violate the First Amendment of the Constitution by restricting religious services. This follows other earlier decisions by the Supreme Court to uphold the First Amendment. So right there, California is being told that they are subject to a higher authority. Yeah. And we need to understand this. But we need to understand that we are also subject to a higher authority, and that is the Word of God. Right. If we forsake the saints by not meeting, by not coming together, by not lifting each other up and not supporting one another, where is that going to leave us? It's going to leave us in a big void. Right. So, yeah. Are we willing to understand what these mean? Are we willing to understand what the higher law is? And are we willing to take the action? Mm-hmm. We need more and more people to come together and understand this. We see some of the churches now that have upheld the higher ruling and have been meeting. Mm-hmm. A lot of them are growing at exponential rates. Mm-hmm. They're really coming together, which says that God is working in that. Are we? Right. And I think we have stayed open, and because of that, our church is starting to grow back and starting to prosper again. But what about all those that have not? We have seen more churches close in this time than in a lot of other times.
Yeah.
So, Pastor, how can we get the... there's one other point I wanted to make. Apparently, one of the churches here locally sued the state of California.
Mm-hmm.
And just this last week, he announced that they won the suit. So that they can stay open. All the fines that have been levied against them are declared null and void. So there's a lot happening right now.
Oh, yeah.
Because they obeyed the higher law.
Mm-hmm.
So, Pastor, how do we get this out? How do we let people know how important it is to come together, to know our rights? And that's not to be necessarily civil disobedience, although there is a place for that.
Mm-hmm.
But to know that our rights, know what the law is, and stand by it.
Yeah.
I know you're a big advocate of doing that, and
I am. I think that you hit the nail on the head when you talked about a greater authority. I've shared this analogy in preaching many times about being a pilot, and when you're flying an aircraft, you have two governing principles at play. You have the law of gravity,
right,
and you have the law of aerodynamics.
Correct.
And the law of aerodynamics is a stronger law.
Correct.
How do we know that? Because airplanes can fly.
Right.
Okay. And birds can fly.
Correct.
And whatever. So, what you have to remember is, as long as you stay within the confines of aerodynamic law, gravity is not an issue.
Right.
However, gravity has never gone away.
Very
it's
true.
still in force.
Right.
It's just you're overriding it with a stronger principle, a stronger law. If you come out from under that, the law of aerodynamics, you immediately come under the law of gravity.
Yes.
And so we can learn a valuable spiritual lessons from this, because in Romans, for instance, and of course this is the scripture that so many pastors quote without even realizing really there's a real lack of understanding here.
Yes, there is.
And the law that's laid before us here in Romans 13 is, okay, all governing authorities get their authority from God. Okay, I have no argument with that whatsoever. I believe that's true.
Correct.
Okay. However, the word clearly tells us, Paul says to imitate me as I imitate Messiah.
Right.
So the insinuation there is, and I realize it's not spelled out in so many words, but the clear insinuation is, if I begin to not follow Messiah, you don't follow me.
Correct.
You follow as long as, you imitate me as long as I'm abiding by this principle.
Correct.
Of following Messiah. So what we have to understand is, yes, the state authorities are there, and even in verse 7 it goes down, it kind of closes the context, but it says, pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed.
Right.
Okay? And that's kind of where it leaves it in the natural realm. Now the issue is we have a spiritual authority as well.
Absolutely.
And the spiritual authority is like the law of aerodynamics. It supersedes the under law.
Correct.
And so if the governing authorities here on earth are not following Messiah's law, the question becomes, do you follow them or do you not?
Right.
So you're going to follow either the governing authorities or God's law, God's principle, God's Torah. You choose.
Yeah.
That's
Exactly.
the bottom line. You choose. Now, it does go on and it says, and this is very interesting because this is counting the cost.
Uh-huh.
As you know, I've been in jail 4 times for civil disobedience.
Right.
So, and I go into civil disobedience understanding there's a cost
Correct.
or a potential cost.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I'm willing to pay that cost to make my voice heard.
Correct.
Okay? And it deals with that right here in let's see, let me switch this translation over to New American. In Romans 13:3 it says, "For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior."
Right.
Now the context is good behavior not towards Messiah, good behavior towards the government.
Right.
So when you comply to what the government is asking you, the government's not a cause of fear for you,
True.
right? You know, unless not in our society anyway, not
Right.
at this point.
Right.
Now, in other societies, that's not necessarily true. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. So, in other words, the government can exercise great authority over you,
True.
even to the point of the sword being put to death. For it is a minister of God, an avenger, who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. So it says that, okay, now it's kind of switching into the spiritual context, assuming that the government is godly and pro-biblical, then they become the avenger of God towards those who practice evil. The problem we have in our society is it's our politicians that are evil,
Right.
right?
That, very
And,
true.
and you can't really exact punishment on them. You can't bring the sword to them
Correct.
for obvious reasons. So what do? Do you continue to follow them? And I've heard so many pastors stand up and say, well, we have to do this because Romans chapter 13. And honestly, I'm tired of hearing that.
Yeah.
It's a lame excuse for cowardice. Strong words, but nevertheless true.
Right. Absolutely.
And this is exactly what the church in Nazi Germany fell into.
Yeah, it was.
I mean, if the church had risen up, I mean, many of the Nazis went to church, by the way.
Yeah. Well, we've said it many times on our program. If the church had risen up here and stood together, we wouldn't be in this mess to begin with.
No, if every single church had refused to shut their doors, what are they going to do?
Right.
Arrest half the nation? Well, no. They don't even have the wherewithal to do that.
Correct.
So what are they going to do? Well, what would have happened is our voice would have been made known.
That's true.
Instead, we splintered off, and a few brave souls refused to abide by this temporary order to shut down, which, by the way, was not law.
Correct. It was not.
It's a suggestion. That's what it is.
Yeah. Although they did levy fines for it, but
They did, but that's against the law.
yeah.
Technically, how can they fine you when you're not breaking the law?
Right.
See? But a law, the governor doesn't have the power to impose law.
That's true.
Only the state legislature has the power to create laws. And we elect them.
Yeah.
The governor enforces those laws.
Yeah.
But he doesn't make laws. So he overstepped his bound. Then he levies fines, which is another overreach.
Right.
And all the time playing the hypocrite, but at the same time using our tax dollars for evil things like abortion.
Correct.
So now what are you going to do?
Well, I think the apostles were a good example. They stood against it, even though they were thrown in prison, even though they were
They did.
martyred at the end.
They did.
How many times did Rabbi Shaul suffer for obeying the word of Messiah?
Well, it's brutal.
It is.
Yeah. So, yes, so the governing authorities have that authority to exact a punishment upon you, even when it's not deserved.
Right. Right.
But they have it, and if they're already misusing their power in the first place, and that's why you're standing up, you can't expect them to do anything else.
Correct.
That would be foolishness in my mind.
Right. Right.
You have to expect the worst case.
Absolutely.
Because, first off, they're going to try to make an example of you, and secondly, they have to defend their position somehow,
Correct.
which they can only defend by tyrannical laws
Yeah.
and behavior. So I think this is becoming an issue of our day, a very serious issue of our day, and I think pastors need to really spend some time looking at this and teaching their congregations appropriately.
Correct.
You know, our politicians are taking such liberties that at some point we're going to have to stand up, or you're going to find yourself fighting God,
Yeah. Absolutely.
even as a believer. And I think this is very crucial. So I think pastors need to really examine their belief system on this. You don't just blindly follow the authorities because they're the authorities in Romans 13 is there. You better understand Romans 13.
Right.
And
Exactly.
for our listeners, the whole context is Romans 13, 1 through 7.
Right.
And
Correct.
and then when we go to other scriptures, like you pointed out already, Doug, now we see what did the apostles do?
Right.
What did Yeshua do? It was against the law to touch a leper.
Right.
Yet he did.
Correct.
He taught things that were contrary. I'm not sure he ever broke the law blatantly or literally, but he certainly came against it.
Right.
In
Well,
his teachings and his actions, both declared there's a higher law here.
Well, with the lame man that was lowered down in front of him, and he healed him on the Sabbath. Not only did he heal him on the Sabbath, but he said, pick up your cot and go.
Yeah.
And that's carrying something on the Sabbath, which
Right.
is also forbidden.
And I realized that wasn't against Roman law. It was against Jewish law, but nevertheless, it was the Jews that demanded his crucifixion, not the Romans.
Correct.
The Romans didn't care about any of that.
Well, in fact, Pontius Pilate says, well, I find nothing against him.
Exactly. So this was the religious people.
Yes.
And we have the same spirit rising up again in the church. These
Correct.
religious, pharisaical spirits rising up in the church that, well, you have to do this because,
Exactly.
you know, and that's just not, it's just not credible or legitimate.
Exactly.
So I think we've got to really examine this. It's becoming a huge issue in our time. And I think we're all going to be faced with some very difficult decisions. And I would just warn our listeners, be careful so you don't wake up one morning on the wrong side of this fence. Because you're either going to be, because the government and the Lord are parting company very quickly.
Very quickly.
So, you know, maybe it's not far enough yet, you can still span the gap. But I'm telling you, before long, you won't be able to span the gap, and you're going to have to pick one side or the other.
Correct.
And the Lord said that. He said, you're either for me or you're against me.
Right.
Forget this in the middle thing. And the more
Yeah.
ungodly the government becomes, which, if you've read to the end of the book, you already know what the outcome is.
Absolutely.
we're heading towards the kingdom of the anti-Messiah.
Yeah.
So what does that tell us? It tells us it's going to be an ungodly society
Correct.
and kingdom.
Absolutely.
Now, even if it didn't take place in our day, we're certainly moving in that direction at breakneck speeds.
Oh, very fast.
So I think this is the day of decision. Choose this day whom you're going to serve.
Absolutely. That's what it's all about.
And know there's going to be a cost. And it could be a heavy cost.
Yeah.
But you've got to choose. And the sooner, let me just say this, the sooner we make that choice and choose, the easier it's going to be to have our voice heard and perhaps turn the tide.
Right, but we got to rise up. We got to stand together. We got to realize that the body is supposed to be one, regardless of what your dogma is.
Right.
You need to come together and stand on godly principles.
Exactly.
And teach godly principles and vote godly principles. The biggest thing is voting right now. How many believers refuse to vote because, well, it doesn't make any difference. Well, my vote doesn't count anyway. Or there's no good person to...
Yeah, that is not the mind of Messiah.
No, it's not.
That is being lazy and unthoughtful.
It is.
And shame on the believers that did that. And there was a lot of them.
Yeah, I agree.
Because they couldn't find the perfect man. Well, where is the perfect man? There is not one.
No, there's not.
Nowhere. And, you know, morality went out the window years ago. So are you going to find a moral man running for office? Probably not.
Right.
Not 100% moral.
Correct.
Or biblical. And of course, when you get into the politics, they reach all the way back into your past. So it all comes up even before you were following the Lord.
True.
Or trying to follow the Lord. So I think that you've got to vote a biblical stance. And you got to say, no, you know what? There's certain things that outweigh other things.
Right.
If, you know, I mean, abortion's a huge issue.
Well,
The Lord says he hates that.
Well, if the church had stood against murder from the beginning, and abortion is murder,
Yeah.
then how could that have passed?
Right. It couldn't have.
It couldn't have.
Except by bloodthirsty murderers.
Right.
And you don't follow them.
Exactly.
Now, if some guy running for office has had an affair that was between two legally of age consenting adults, although we don't approve of that morally, that's not as big a crime against God as, say, abortion.
Correct.
Now, are we happy with the affair? No, it's not right. And we need to be a voice that deals with that.
Correct.
But right now, that's not the voice we need to deal with.
Right. There's too many other things that are a lot heavier.
We need to deal with the heavier issues right now, in
Absolutely.
my opinion. And then after we get these taken care of, let's work our way down into these other arenas. They are important.
Oh yeah.
But they're not. They're yesterday's news.
Right.
And we really need to prioritize and get these things figured out.
Absolutely. And the only way we can do that is the church or the believers have to come together. You have to stop running because of fear, and you have to realize that our government officials are supposed to represent us as the people. If we're the majority, if Christians are the majority, why aren't our representatives Christians?
Well, because we're either not voting or we're voting the wrong
There you
ticket,
go.
the wrong way.
Yep. So we need to make ourselves heard as one crying in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
And my friends, that's all the time we have for today. But please join us again next time. And if you want Pastor Bruce's books, please go to www PastorBruceDowell.com or to Amazon.com. And if you want to see our videos, go to www.shilomessianic.com. And until next time, shalom.
Shalom.